and welcome to Horns of Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, executive editor of TNSR. Listeners who've been paying attention will notice that social media is playing an increasingly prominent role in the discourse. Just this week, Twitter announced that it was sanctioning the president's son for promoting false information about a potential cure for COVID, and we've seen information about interference in the elections by multiple foreign actors, often using social media as a vector. Listeners to the War on the Rocks podcast may recall that in May, I did a podcast with Jessica Brandt of the German Marshall Fund and Alliance for Securing Democracy and Camille Francois of Graphica dealing with the question of disinformation. It's also been covered in more popular press with books such as Like War by Singer and Brookings and War in 140 Characters by Patrick Karakas. But very few of these explorations have gone into systemically how these things affect international relations. Our guest today unpacks just that very question. Professor Sarah Kreps is the John L. Wetherill Professor of Government and an adjunct professor of law at Cornell University. I would also add she is an incredibly prolific scholar who puts out a book about every 2 years that makes a remarkable contribution to the discourse about war, society, and technology. And it's a real pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Doyle. It's great to be here.
So can you tell us a little bit about the rest of your research?
Yeah. So, and I don't want to be too autobiographical, but I will for just by way of background. So I am a recovering natural scientist. So I was a pre-med major, physics major in college, and but I was also Air Force ROTC. So I was from the very beginning bringing in the study of military technology and then later politics and political science. So I served in the military, active duty, for 4 years, and I worked on radar systems for the E-3 AWACS, the Predator, overhead surveillance satellites, NATO interoperability. And so really what this gave me was a real world exposure to the technical aspects of war. I was on active duty when the U.S. went to war in Afghanistan and Iraq. So these big strategic questions of war, why we go to war, the role of public opinion, legislative checks and balances, and permissiveness, have really percolated in my mind for decades. So all of my research really is brought together around these themes. So my first book was on coalition warfare, in part because of the work I had done with NATO and interoperability. I wrote a couple of books on drone warfare. And the fourth book was about how the U.S. and advanced industrialized democracies pay for the wars, again, in part because I had worked in the Pentagon and I thought a lot about the billions of dollars that the U.S. spends paying for wars and its military. And now this recent question of social media that really came about from the work I had done at that intersection of technology and politics and political science. And so it had really been this evolution, from drones, from coalition warfare to drones. And then I was working on kind of cyber. And then there's this question really embedded in the social media book about information warfare. And so this specific aspect of it obviously was brought to light with the 2016 election, but international relations scholars really hadn't taken those questions seriously. So I think this is kind of a natural evolution that has gone back a couple of decades, really, from kind of the early experience working in labs as an undergrad, then in the military, and then kind of bringing this together around these themes of international relations.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I really appreciate about the book is, as I said, there's a lot of sort of, popular literature on it that explores some of the same themes, but I think what you do that is unique and really valuable is tying it to the theoretical framework of international relations and international politics and also questions of conflict and security in a way that I think is much more rigorous than you see in a lot of the other stuff that's there. And I think it's a great contribution. So just briefly, I mean, your argument is that social media does affect international relations. I should have said spoiler alert before I said that for anyone who is going to pick up the book. But can you outline for us briefly what the causal mechanism is?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a causal mechanism per se, but kind of a theoretical pathway. And maybe I would just take a step back and position this as again, kind of my natural interest in interdisciplinary work, but thinking about how, as you were saying, a lot of engineers and CS, computer science folks will focus on those aspects of social media. A lot of the political comms people will focus really on that side, and bringing these two together seemed like something that Mark Zuckerberg, in his testimonies on Capitol Hill, which again, he's not physically there. I don't know whether this is remote or not, but he's testifying today. But when he was last there, and really every time he kind of talks about Facebook's role, he drops references to Facebook as an actor of global governance. And he says things like Facebook is more like a government than a traditional company. And so I was kind of naturally piqued about this. Well, what does that really mean? Is that true? And what would that look like? But it was also clear as I thought about what was going on that the U.S. really had been outsourcing the regulation of public spaces to a private company, which in turn was outsourcing that regulation to its advertisers who are using the levers of capitalism to boycott when Facebook didn't go far enough on content moderation. So I started thinking, well, what is the role of these social media firms in a liberal democracy like the United States? So one of the early talks I gave on this was actually out at Stanford. And I remember these, IR luminaries, Joe Nye and Mike McFaul, talking about, urging against kind of these definitions or labels of democracy and non-democracy. So I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And because they're liberal democracies, countries that have elections but no freedom of the press. But really, the reason why I stick with democracy here is because I think that's really the feature of what's going on that allows for these social media firms to almost act like governments in international relations. And so the mechanism is kind of like this. So in a democracy, in the context of conflict, because I think this is kind of not just the focus of my book, but probably the interest of the listeners, the context of war and peace. The theory has been that democracies have been successful because of a marketplace of ideas. So you get debate and in the newspapers and on TV and online that can ferret out bad ideas and debate them until the bad ones go away and you're left with the good ones. So obviously there are big exceptions to that, which, Iraq and Vietnam brought to mind. But generally, I'm kind of persuaded that system of democracy and the marketplace of ideas works or worked. I think the challenge with democracies in an era of social media is now it's really like the Wild West. It's very, in some ways, overly democratized. Anyone can post. We know that fake news travels faster than real news because it's flashy and controversial. Some of the recent misinformation videos on COVID-19 show both that this content moves faster than, let's say, a bland CDC video, Centers for Disease Control video. But also, efforts to bring down the content actually draws more traffic. And so we've known a long time about information warfare, but here democracies really are playing with one hand behind their backs compared to autocracies because the Russian ads are bought on Facebook. They hyper-target segments through digital personalization. So you get the big data, you study who's clicking on what, correlate the demographics, and then make sure that these audiences that are going to respond to inflammatory content for them are going to click and be inflamed. And so democracies like the US make that easier because we're already polarized. But then the absence of content moderation has meant that it's very easy to kind of like insinuate yourself, or if you're the Russian actors or Chinese, into that political space. And by contrast, autocracies can censor challenge online. So China has a 2 million person army of people that's just all the time pushing back on anti-regime narratives. So that's really kind of the argument in a nutshell, which is that, you have the democratic disadvantage and the autocratic advantage when it comes to the way in which people consume news in an era of social media.
And, one of the things that I think is really intriguing about this pathway that you describe is that it takes very seriously the role of legitimacy. I think one of the points that you make, and it's a very important one, is that misinformation or disinformation need not persuade the recipient of the other narrative. It only needs to erode faith in the institutions from which they would otherwise get reliable information. And so I really found that interesting about how that affects autocracies and democracies differently because they have a different reliance on legitimacy and a different source of legitimacy in each case. So I thought that was an interesting point. And one of the other things that the pathway that you talk about talks a lot about the effect that it has on approval or disapproval of foreign policy choices, with a follow-on effect on likely preferences among political candidates. And I know that, some international relations purists, when they see foreign policy or foreign relations, are going to say, haha, that's not IR, that's foreign relations, that's something different. They'll wave their copy of Ken Waltz in your face. But I really thought that you dealt with that nicely by addressing the concept of sovereignty and how social media interacts with it. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Right. And no, your insights about legitimacy are really important. I think that is something that, again, we're seeing in the public health space about what people should believe, or what they believe they can believe and what they can't, sort of the idea that there's a big T truth out there. And so I'm going to lead with this question of foreign policy, which is, I thought, where you were going, which is, when I think about what was successful in the Cold War, it was that there were shared reference points. There was a shared understanding about kind of who the US was, who the West was, and who the Soviet Union was. And it was kind of clear cut which side we were on and which side they were on. And having these shared reference points was really important for creating coherent foreign policy. And what we've seen, in the years since the Cold War is an erosion of that. And it's sort of into that backdrop that you see kind of this fracturing of media and fracturing of coherence. And I think that's where you get, again, this kind of amplification of so many different perspectives and a lack of kind of these reference points, right? Because no one is that these videos about misinformation or the fake news or these posts from the Russian Internet Research Agency just kind of aren't, again, meant to change anyone's views, but just undermine the legitimacy of the news that people are getting. Anyway, so back to international relations, though, I think it's a really fair point, which is, well, foreign policy, as you said, as Waltz would have us taught us, is not international relations theory. But what I was trying to engage with were these questions of sovereignty. And for that was going back to, and I think this was building on Zuckerberg's assertion that Facebook is really like a government, more like a government than a company. And so I thought, well, what does that sound like? That sounds like what I learned in my IR theory classes as a graduate student, complex interdependence. And Keohane and I talked about multinationals that almost acted like governments. And it seemed like social media companies were doing a lot of that, kind of imposing their values, corporate values, onto individuals and countries that use their media. In some ways, what I think has been interesting, when I first was writing this book, I was thinking more about how that works in the context of countries that are reliant on Google and Facebook, because if you're Denmark, you're not necessarily coming up with your own Google because it's not cost effective to do that. So Europe in particular is reliant on, it really had been the US for both search engines and data storage. Increasingly, it sort of diversifies with China. But what we see now, which has been much more kind of squarely in the news, is the question of TikTok. So it's, Chinese owned. And there is this kind of question of sovereignty, and wherein the question of whether China's government is using this data, frankly, to understand either the U.S. electorate or specific high users in the U.S. And that does raise these questions of sovereignty and fundamental principles of international relations, which is, once you're using TikTok, what else are you kind of signing up for? So it's not a violation of sovereignty per se, but kind of a softening of the borders that I think now what we're seeing is are hardening again. So the U.S. is saying that government personnel can't have TikTok on their devices. U.S. companies now are trying to recapture that particular market. And so I think it's akin to what Abe Newman and Henry Farrell called weaponized interdependence, that there's this reliance on other countries' goods and services in a way that gives those suppliers a lot of leverage. What I think now, again, we're seeing is a reassertion of sovereignty. Europe did this with the move to GDPR, privacy reasserting digital sovereignty. but I think that's where the international relations part of this comes in, is what do we mean by governments? What do we mean by sovereignty? And who creates the rules of that sort of order, and then who follows them?
Yeah, and I really appreciate the way that you bring out in the book how this technology both poses unique challenges to the traditional monopolies of the state, but also affords some real advantages to states that are unconstrained by some of the concerns that democracies have and how it is that they apply them.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned earlier how this relates to questions of war and peace. And of course, as a War College graduate, I can't talk about questions of war and peace without invoking our favorite dead Prussian, which in fact you do. You bring up Clausewitz, but I really appreciated that rather than stopping at the traditional invocation of politics by other means, you discussed the Clausewitzian trinity in the context of social media. And I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit. What is the trinity and how does the social media affect that?
All right. Yeah. So we have we have government, policy, and politics, the military, which is the capabilities, and people, where they might have kind of like antipathies and passions. And the media then is this kind of facilitator / interlocutor between these different points on the Trinity. And where I saw this is again in that intersection of social media and information warfare, which is how can outside actors, how can malicious actors, how can any actors be using social media to tap into or exacerbate or inflame, especially, I think, the population, the people on that front. And that's what I think has been happening, is this, that as people consume more particular kinds of social media, as they're targeted through this hyper-targeting and digital personalization, the hate and enmity get ramped up, and in ways that are percolating up to the government, kind of who we elect and their policies, which then affect the strategies and the strategies that countries like the U.S. enact, and the deployment of their militaries.
Yeah. And, it also, I think, goes back to that same discussion we were just having about legitimacy. There's a great definition of legitimacy by, I believe it's Alan Craig, it's a value judgment that gives authority to the exercise of power. And by attacking that people government leg, what you do is erode the validity and legitimacy of the traditional sources of that value judgment and make it much more difficult and constrain the choices of a government in how it is that they can exercise that power. And I thought that was a really great point that you made in there. Now, one of the sports of anyone who's ever sat in an IR seminar when someone comes up with an idea is to say, well, this is nothing new. And you, in fact, address this. You say, you can trace the roots of the internet and Facebook back to the Roman Forum. And in fact, there can be an argument that the printing press had a dramatic change on international relations, that radio and that television, that satellite television all had these effects. You look at these things, but you conclude that social media is different. Why and how?
So, yes, this is a question I got at a seminar, actually at GW a year and a half ago. It was exactly that question. It was, is this any different? Or is this and I think that's why I have this section. Is this just old wine in new media bottles? Was it a question or really more of a comment?
It
was a question. Comment masquerading as a question. It got me thinking. It was great, actually, because it is an important question. So I think, yes, it is a difference. So my argument is that it's a difference of degree, that is where the degree is so big that it becomes like a difference of kind. And so the metaphor I was thinking about was kind of the difference between a nuclear and a conventional weapon, is that some people have made the argument that nuclear weapons, well, there's some tactical nuclear weapons that are actually lower yield than the largest conventional weapon. But generally, these nuclear weapons are such a difference in magnitude that they also become a difference in both degree and in kind. And that's kind of the argument I was trying to traffic in with the ideas of social media, is that, yes, we've always had propaganda. We had, the U.S. did a lot of work with Radio Free Europe in the Cold War, and we tried to get all sort of the local languages to be broadcasting about the virtues of the West. But what is different here is speed and the reach. So and also kind of one of the points I make is the role of gatekeepers. So if you think about kind of Radio Free Europe, you have one broadcaster. He's broadcasting is all kind of a one-way transmission. It's the hub and spoke. So transmitting out to the listeners, and it's hard to kind of bottle all that up and then amplify it further. So now, instead of having one broadcaster, we have literally 7 billion potential broadcasters. So anyone can post. And, unlike the New York Times, which is going to do kind of some fact checking and it's going to do some gatekeeping, and then, so you have kind of a filter and an editorial process. Anything goes here. So any one of these 7 billion people can post something if it's really, that's what's amazing about TikTok, is that some of these videos, this Cornell student, this freshman this year, had, millions of followers and likes on his TikTok videos. And so he's, just some 18-year-old in a college dorm. And so that stuff goes viral. And so that's what's, I think, very different here, is that the ability to amplify it, it's multidimensional. And then within seconds, it can literally travel the world. And again, I'll bring up these examples of videos and posts on COVID-19. Another one was put up this week. And because it can travel so fast, it literally traveled the world before the content moderators can do anything with it. And then because people can manipulate the modality of it so quickly, or the location of it, it's virtually impossible to bring down. And so that's the key difference. Those are the key differences, is just that you can end up with this scale and reach and speed that were impossible during the Roman era.
And when you mentioned the nuclear weapons analogy, it also made me think of that passage from Schelling where he says that, there's nothing you can do with nuclear weapons that you can't do with an ice pick, except that with nuclear weapons, you don't have to defeat the army first. And it strikes me that similarly, social media and information warfare allows you to attack this central leg of government legitimacy and government capacity without escalating to the use of force. And so you can do this without having to not having to defeat anyone, but never actually giving cause theoretically for retaliation.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great point. I was thinking too about kind of coming back to these questions of, how you pay for wars and these asymmetries. So Russia spends apparently about $12 million a year on its Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. $12 million. And by comparison, just the budget alone of Radio Free Europe is 10 times that. And so they're able to do this by paying a couple of guys. They advertise that you should have some language proficiency. And they pay these people to just sit there for 12 hours and generate content, and at a fraction of the cost of let's not even talk about the cost of an F-22.
Yeah, or the $10 million contract we just let to clean up after the fire on Bonhomme Richard.
Right.
Just about the budget of the Internet Research Agency. That works perfectly.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so Russia, which is kind of hobbling along, is able to be competitive in this arena in ways that they couldn't if they were going toe to toe in a conventional way. And, one of the really interesting things about this too, to your point, is that escalation is virtually impossible, which is good in the context of, war and peace and not winning wars. But it also means that there's not much to deter other countries from acting in these nefarious ways, because deterrence won't stop them.
Sure. So we've got this really rosy outlook of all the terrible things that people and governments can do. And now we add technology to the mix. And you spent some time talking about the impact of both artificial intelligence and deep fakes on how it further accelerates these trends. First, can you tell us what deep fakes are and how do these things affect it?
So deep fakes are computer created artificial videos that images are combined. They create new footage that depict events or statements or actions that didn't actually happen. So we've seen these now with, major known figures, Mark Zuckerberg included, and Obama and Nancy Pelosi. But the way in which this can work is because of technology, we have thousands of images. This is kind of your big data that goes into machine learning to figure out how to create new images based on the bulk images. So coming back to these questions of legitimacy, now you add in some technology where you see this image, you see, let's say, a political ad, and it's not authentic, and it's saying things or having this actor do things that they didn't actually do. That's another way in which democracy is, the sort of foundations of democracy are eroded because people don't know what to believe. They don't know what's legitimate. They don't know what's real or not. The videos and the imagery, I think, have gotten the most attention as these deep fakes, but increasingly also there is technology for text. And so that's where it comes back to this question of the Internet Research Agency. And, if these guys, they have quotas they have to reach. And then, at some point you run out, as we all do, we all get writer's block. But they have to be writing a certain type of content that isn't flagged as plagiarized. And so, you get these natural language programs that and in fact, there was a piece in the New York Times on this today, and it's an AI model I've used as well, which then can use kind of kernel bits of, I don't mean bits and bytes, but parts of an actual text. You put it into this model, and then it churns out original and very credible verbiage that you can use then to kind of insert into this whole kind of information space, so that you're not going to be flagged as plagiarized. Now you can hyper target the people with, if what you want to do is target, let's say, people on the left and really just troll them. So maybe what you want to do is take some content from a Breitbart on the right and send this to them and then target them. And then, now all of a sudden you're just further inflaming, the U.S. political landscape. So I think technology really does act as kind of a force multiplier then it's not sort of independently going to change things, but I think it then accelerates and amplifies the effects that we were just talking about.
Yeah. And I think when you were mentioning that, I think most of us could think of, and probably were thinking of, a family member or extended family member who forwards exactly those sorts of outraged things from those sorts of sources. And it's very effective. But I was really fascinated by the experiments that you conducted, and they're sort of at the heart of your stuff, that look exactly at this, at how can these technologies affect the valence, the salience, the virality of these messages. And if you could describe these experiments for us, tell us what it is you were trying to test for and what you found. I just found these really fascinating.
Well, thanks, Doyle. So this was kind of a proof of concept. I've been doing some work with this group, OpenAI, out in the Bay Area, and they create these models, these machine learning models. So they put in terabytes of data and stories from the internet to basically do text prediction. So if you have then all this internet content, and it then is able to teach this model that if you have, let's say, North Korean leader, well, there's a 95% chance that the next words are Kim Jong-un. And so it teaches the model to more complicated things like, well, what about the word bank? Is a bank a place you go to get money, or is it the side of a river? So through all this machine learning and big data, it can suss this out. And so I did an experiment to see whether this might, what the kind of potential use case is for a malicious actor who's, again, sitting in St. Petersburg. They've run out of ideas. What do we come up with next? We need something inflammatory. So I was curious whether if you wanted to churn out unlimited content, could you use the first part of a New York Times story, or the first part of your Breitbart story, or the first part of your story from The Nation, and churn out hundreds of inflammatory or descriptive or whatever posts. And it turns out that, so when I ran this, and I ran it on samples of American readers in the American electorate, that not only were these stories as credible as a New York Times story, but in some cases they were more credible. So it was a little bit alarming to see that. In fact, this is what this New York Times reporter today, that one of the tech reporters said, well, I guess I'll soon be out of a job. And it's not so much the worry. I think, well, maybe he's probably worried because that's his backyard. But it's more the question of what does that mean for this media landscape? If now you can just kind of churn out bogus but credible material content and have people believe it and be inflamed by it, that I think is a real threat to democracy. And you can see how the potential avenues for this are also unlimited. So I'm working on a couple of more projects along those lines now that would affect, let's say, democratic representation. And so I think that stands to make an even larger impact, whether you're the malicious actor, trying to kind of insinuate yourself into our domestic politics.
Yeah. And I appreciated that you included in the book an example that the AI doesn't always get it right. And if you don't mind, I'm going to share an excerpt from a story that was generated by the AI. And this was in response to Kim Jong-un, if I recall. Mm-hmm. But the paragraph runs, "Life is a place full of surprises!" ! "Melts a glorious Easter cake in French, but not that green. Well, a green cake, but for a Tuesday, of course. All Easter party year, and here is the reason for Baka. So here is the unsophisticated basket from my emails with Moet House. Magical Easter treating for outdoor ahead, serving up the latter too, because coconut would smell really good and it is about 32 degrees centigrade, 94 degrees Fahrenheit." And it goes on like that. And I'm going to hope that wasn't one of the ones that was regarded as just as credible as a New York Times story. But I appreciated you including that because I think we've all received emails that resemble that somewhat in the course of things, some of which were actually written by people. But, in the third iteration of your experiment, you did something I thought was really interesting, which is that you provided prompts to the machine that drew from sources highly identified with one partisan side or the other. So for Breitbart for the conservative right-wing side and Huffington Post for the left-wing progressive side. And you evaluated the effect that those AI-generated stories from those prompts had on people who had this particular partisan identification in terms of how well they identified it as fake and their propensity to share it. And you also evaluated at the same time the efficacy of warning labels. And this obviously was an issue that came up when Twitter chose to put a warning label on one of the president's tweets. And so it raises this question of, how effective are these things? And I thought the results were kind of interesting. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, right. So it is interesting because the work on corrections is not optimistic. The corrections generally aren't very effective. And so, but in this case, right. So these corrections did not necessarily have an impact on, and it depends on kind of which side you're looking at. So Republicans, if they had a correction of a Fox News story that was AI generated, statistically it didn't do anything. Yeah, and our disclaimer said something along the lines of, and it was in red, bold, warning, this may be manipulated or synthetic content. And so the Republicans did not discount their Fox News AI generated content, but actually the Democrats discounted their Huffington Post, which is what we had used. So if a Democrat had read a story on Huffington Post that was then given a disclaimer, they actually did find it significantly less credible. So it almost seemed as though the Democrats were more kind of amenable to a disclaimer about their politically congenial news source, the Huffington Post, than the Republicans were about Fox News. The Democrats, on the other hand, didn't find the Fox News story credible at all, which was really interesting because we didn't label these Fox News, Huffington Post. It was just clear kind of from the tenor I guess partisans could tell which was which.
Yeah, I found that really interesting. But one of the things that I think is fascinating about that is once you introduce this element of partisan bias, when you have so many people who are drawing their news from congenial sources and that news is being amplified through the effects you've described of social media, it seems to me like the lines between domestic politics and international relations and foreign policy become blurry at best, if not start to disappear entirely. Is that a fair takeaway?
Yeah, I think that was a really sharp read of one of the takeaways here, which is that I think that's right. And I think that's been happening in the IR space since we started with Ken Waltz. We'll come back to him again, because I think that, yes, on the one hand, it's clear that the U.S.-China relationship of the distribution of power is still very real. At the same time, I think what we're also seeing is that structural realism really has its limits, because domestic politics play a pretty significant role in how countries behave. And so I think that this is kind of furthering that trend that emphasizes, the importance of domestic politics and suggests that maybe these structural theories don't tell us everything we need to know.
Yeah, and you also have a great quote from de Tocqueville in the book about the role of newspapers, and I believe it's something along the lines of, it's the advisor that's at every person's breakfast table without importuning them, or something to that effect. Reading that also reminded me of one of my other favorite de Tocqueville phrases. It was the title of the book that Robert Bellah and his team put together in 1976, Habits of the Heart, talking about the habits of community that bring us together despite the sort of fragmenting efforts of liberalism. And it strikes me there's a connection here between this idea of the degree to which partisan polarization, partisan identification, the willingness to believe information seems to me like it erodes these habits of community, these things that help us identify as a single polity rather than as a tribe within that. Is that fair, or is that something you've looked at all?
Right. I think that's a good read, and I forget what year Bob Putnam's Bowling Alone came out, but it does start to feel like that again, kind of this fractiousness of American society, wherein, and again, in part, kind of this personalization of everything. And, whereas there are no kind of 3 evening news networks, now everything is so niche, and that may be, people may really get what they want that way, but I think at a potential cost, which is you don't have that unifying experience anymore. And I think that that's, again, kind of a great virtue of democracy, is that you have choice. But I think that this can be not just a virtue, but a vice.
Yeah, and I mean, it strikes me that it almost interacts with the sovereignty question again, is that every person becomes sovereign in their own consumption of information and the world that they build and the identities that they choose to place weight on, and the communities that they try to build there. You're less stuck with the geographic closeness of your neighbors. I can now choose to identify with someone who shares other characteristics and lives halfway across the country in a different way. So You conclude with a not entirely bleak outlook as you talk about some of the takeaways. Because, I mean, it's easy to kind of take a look at this. And you talk about the democratic disadvantage. You talk about the advantage that authoritarian countries have, both in terms of their ability to manipulate messages within their own country and their willingness to manipulate for their own gain within our country. But you do have some positive views in the conclusion in terms of things that we can do. Can you talk a little bit about what the outlook is and what it is you think democracies can and ought to do?
Yeah, no, it's great, because usually I do feel like dispositionally I'm a glass half full kind of optimist. But it's hard, I cite this Reagan quote from '89 saying that the quote, "The Goliath of totalitarianism will be brought down by the David of the microchip." And the suggestion was that Silicon Valley would create these tools and help groups organize to overcome authoritarian rule. And so this like cyber utopianism. And I really think that there were some initial glimmers of hope that might be the case. And I just think that what we've seen in recent years is that that's not at all the case, because these autocrats have more tools at their advantage. So the question, yes, is what is the silver lining to be ending on? And I think that's still really an open question, unfortunately, because I think we're still kind of in the middle of figuring out what this all looks like, including today with these big tech companies testifying in Congress, because I think that for a while it really was the Wild West, and all content was protected under the Communications Decency Act. But I think that there was a real sense that maybe that went too far. And so now there's a question of reining it in. But now the question is that politically motivated? Is there ideological bias in that? Do we think that the cure is worse than the disease, and that now taking a heavier hand to content moderation is actually going to be letting these big tech companies, again, do the heavy lifting of that the Supreme Court has adjudicated, free speech cases for years, but that's their actual business. They are barristers that are trained in understanding the law. And now you have these big tech companies who are litigating this and adjudicating what's free speech versus hate speech. So I'm not sure that I'm prepared to say that there's that we're at a point where there's a real silver lining. I think that we're still figuring out kind of how to frame these questions, what the questions are, and really how to engage in the kind of oversight that in some ways kind of brings regulation of a public space back to a public forum, rather than outsourcing all of this to private firms. Now, I'm all about letting private firms do what they want, but it also has to be kind of, there needs to be a cognizance of, again, kind of this free marketplace of ideas, while also respecting and guarding against hate speech. Not respecting hate speech, guarding against hate speech is what I meant.
Yeah, and when you turn that regulation over to private entities, you adopt a very different set of standards. I mean, the First Amendment begins with Congress shall make no law. And, that affects the actions of the government. When you're looking at the actions of private entities, really it becomes liability on the civil side that almost becomes the motivating factor. And, if speech is going to be defined by what avoid the lawsuit, that's a very different marketplace of ideas than the one that, is held up as this idealized norm. So yeah, I agree that this question of where that responsibility attaches, and as a consequence of where that attaches, what the standards will be, is a really critical one. And it's one that we haven't grappled with completely yet. Any closing thoughts that you'd leave our listeners with?
Right. I would just say that I don't think this is necessarily meant to provide the last word or answers, but really start to frame the right questions and rethink some of these fundamental theories of international relations that I think have been taken for granted, and think about the role of media in affecting and kind of both bringing down some of these lines of sovereignty, but also now resuscitating them as well. And I think I guess I would also say that it foreshadows, I think, now the upcoming election, which had been kind of part of the motivation is like a lot of people reflecting on the 2016 election and then looking ahead to the 2021. But I don't even think we need to look that far, because I think already we've seen how this is playing out in a quite different issue area, which is the role of medical misinformation. And in a lot of ways, we're seeing similar dynamics of just this: what is truth? How do we think about content moderation? How do we respond to Chinese and Russian efforts to disseminate misinformation? And how do we think about it in our own public space? So I think these are all just kind of ongoing questions where technology in a lot of ways is leading and we're reacting. And now this is just kind of an attempt to catch us up.
Yeah. And one of the really troubling and fascinating things about that is that it's not as if China or Russia has to create the congeniality within the United States for those messages to be shared. All they've got to do is just put the coin in the machine. And it's a little bit frightening. We've been speaking with Professor Sarah Kreps. She is the John L. Wetherell Professor in the Department of Government and an adjunct professor of law at Cornell University. She is the author most recently of Social Media and International Relations. And also, I should have mentioned at the start, a member of Texas National Security Review's editorial board. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Doyle.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.